grew up under the oppressive boot of an occupying Roman army. That's the kind of thing that would give birth to a fierce, even patriotic violence in the heart of anyone, especially if that person, if that man, is a natural-born leader. Toiling under the hot Palestinian sun, sweat poured down his face, and there was an unquenchable thirst for freedom. But more than just a thirst for freedom, there was a growing awakening, a dawning, a sense that he really was the promised one that was written by the prophets. He is the Messiah, God's chosen one, and he is really the hope for the people, and their freedom rests on his shoulders. Men and women began to flock to him and gave their allegiance to him as he is the Messiah, the hope of Israel. But his death ended in a violent, chaotic revolt. And of course, you know exactly who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Menahem ben Judah. Oh, did you think I was talking about somebody else? You don't know who Menahem ben Judah is? Well, certainly you know this one. You know Judas, right? Judas also claimed to be the Messiah. He also gathered men and women to follow him and to give him their allegiance. And he taught them, listen, bring all of your possessions and join me down at the Jordan River and begin to cross into the river. And I'm going to give a command and the waters are going to part and you're going to walk on dry land and you're going to be safe. And of course, men and women trusted him. He's the Messiah. And they walked into the water and he was unable to cause the waters to part. And many of them drowned. You've never heard of Judas before? He claimed to be the Messiah. How is it that you've never heard of him? I get it. You're probably 0 for 2 right now. You're not up on all the guys throughout history who claim to be Israel's Messiah. But there's one more, and I bet you're going to get this right. He is from Galilee. He claimed to be the Messiah. Many men and women thought that he was the Messiah. His name starts with a J. Go ahead and just say his name out loud to those who you're watching this with. That's right. You got it. It is Judas the Galilean. What? You've never heard of him either? These 3 guys that I mentioned, and I could mention many others, they all made extraordinary claims about themselves. They all claimed that they were the Messiah, the promised one of the prophets, the promised one of God, coming to give freedom and hope and rescue to the people. How is it that you've never heard of any of these yahoos? How is it that in first century Palestine, that it was common, it was not an unusual thing for someone to claim, hey, I'm the one that's here to save you. That was not uncommon. It wasn't novel. Maybe it wasn't even interesting. What is extraordinary is that we actually know the name of one of the guys who claimed to be the Messiah. We know the name Jesus. Jesus' claim to be the Messiah, his message and his movement moved throughout the entire world. And so that causes me to ask this question, what is it? What is it about Christianity that caused it to go viral? Why did Christianity spread? Why did Christianity endure when all the other Messiah movements faded out and died as soon as their leader died? What made Christianity different? See, the thing that made Christianity different is this. The thing that caused the followers of this particular Messiah to spread his message, the thing that caused it to endure is this right here. The resurrection validated what Jesus claimed about himself. This is probably one of the most clear, maybe the boldest declarations that Jesus ever made about himself. In John, it says this, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Historians, sociologists, anthropologists, they all strike out, they all come up empty and trying to figure out a compelling, meaningful explanation for why did the Jesus Messiah movement continue to spread when all the other ones faded out and all the other ones died as soon as their leader died. Now, if you think that you have an explanation for why Christianity endured, you should write a book. You'll probably make millions because the academic world is waiting for a meaningful, comprehensive explanation other than the resurrection. I want you to remember that Jesus wasn't the first one to make extraordinary claims about himself. And yet his message, which we call the gospel, it spread around the world. It has defied every national border. It's overcome every single language barrier. It has crossed over all kinds of social categories and class structures. It has unified people from all kinds of social categories and class structures. It has outlasted the boundaries of time. And this message of the gospel, it has inspired men and women from the very first century, even until today. It has inspired men and women to move from casual observer to committed follower. The one notable difference between Jesus and all of these other would-be messiahs is that he is the only one who actually rose from the dead. It's that single moment in history. It's that single verifiable historical moment that changed everything, that caused men and women to trust what he said and to share what he said. Now, I find it completely understandable that smart people would say, wait a second, I don't know if that's true. As a matter of fact, I expect for good-hearted, intelligent people to instinctively doubt that somebody actually rose from the dead. I mean, after all, isn't it most likely that the followers of Jesus, they didn't want the party to end. They didn't want the movement to stop. They wanted it to keep going. And so maybe, just maybe, they made up the resurrection story to keep it all going. Have you ever heard of Bart Airman? Bart Airman is one of the world's leading New Testament scholars today. He's a distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina. He is not a man who believes that the Bible is sacred. As a matter of fact, he's very skeptical about the existence of God. He's a committed agnostic. But I want you to hear what he has to say about this. That Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. They believed this, they lived it, and they died for it. Jesus lived, Jesus died, and those who were closest to him, those who knew him the best, were convinced that he rose from the dead. Now, it's one thing to simply claim that somebody rose from the dead. Anybody can make that claim. But in order to keep that message going, these people, they had to face mistreatment, the confiscation of their property. They were beaten, they were tortured. Many of them were brutally killed. And all they ever had to do to stop the mistreatment was to stop claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. But they continued to spread that message. Why would they do that? There was something about the resurrection message. There was something about what Jesus had done that was so compelling that it connected them to something so precious. They valued it more than their own life. You see, the resurrection validated what Jesus claimed about his followers. What we're about to read next was written by a guy named the Apostle Paul. He actually started out his adult life trying to stamp out Christianity. He was a violent persecutor of Christians. He wanted to get rid of it. He did not believe it at all, but it was the reality of the resurrection that caused him to become a follower of Jesus, and ultimately, he became a leader of Christians. Writing about the implications of the resurrection of Jesus, this is what he has to say. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. If you've trusted in Jesus, if you've given your allegiance to Jesus, if you've trusted in what he did and what he said, then you've trusted him in faith, and you are children of God through that faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. What the Apostle Paul is describing for us is that Jesus did more than simply change history. He changed his followers' identity. Could I get personal with you for a moment? Could we really connect and maybe get a little bit vulnerable? I want to ask you, how do you think about you? What is the bedrock of your identity? What makes you, you? I like to think of identity like a deck of cards. In a deck of cards, there are many different cards that make it up, and they're all different. And our identities are the exact same thing. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a pastor, I'm a bad golfer. There are all kinds of things that make me, me, and there are all kinds of things that make you, you. But the thing that makes your life really worthwhile, the thing that gives you your purpose and your meaning for living, the thing that makes your life worth living, that's your top card. And every single one of us has a top card. And our top card really is the bedrock of our identity. It's what makes us who we are. It's the thing that if we lost it, we wouldn't just lose something we value. We would lose our sense of self. Real quick, I want to talk to the men who are watching this right now. So if you're watching this in a group, I want you to turn and make sure that your dad or your husband, make sure whatever guy is in the group with you, make sure that he's leaning in and paying attention. All right. You got them leaning in? They're watching me. Guys, there's something that's connected to a lot of us. There's something that's very often connected to your top card and to my top card, and that's our ability to provide. And that's our ability to fix things and to solve problems. And the reality that we're living in right now, living in a COVID-19 world, means that for many of us, our ability to provide and our ability to solve problems, we're not able to do that in the way that we would like to be able to live up to. And let me say this. If your top card, if the thing that ultimately makes you you means that you have to control things that are out of your control, whenever a crisis hits, it has the ability to not just cause you to lose something that's valuable to you, but it could cause you to lose your sense of self. All right, let me draw everybody back in. Everybody pay attention now. I want you to imagine with me what it's like. The world that you live in, you don't get to pick your top card. You don't get to choose what it is. It's chosen for you. It's predetermined at your birth. You have no say whatsoever. Your parents' religion, that's your religion. Your parents' job, that's your job. You know, where you live and the social status that your parents birthed you into, that's what you have for life. Your potential, your opportunity, your future, it is defined by your family, by your gender, by your social class. And what I'm describing for you right now, that is a form of status enslavement. There's nothing you can do to change it. And what I'm describing, that's exactly what life was like for the majority of human history, for the majority of men and women who have ever lived. And that's exactly what life was like when the message of the gospel began to dawn on the world. In the first century, in the Roman world, you did not get to choose your top card. You didn't get to choose your identity. It was chosen for you. It was status enslavement. Now, it's probably difficult for you and for me to really relate to that. I mean, your parents' name, that is a part of you, but it doesn't predetermine your future. Where you were born, that's a big part of you, but it doesn't predetermine your future. Your gender, that's a big part of you, but it doesn't predetermine your future. In the world where the gospel began to spread like wildfire, it was a time and it was a place where people's status was fixed. They could not change it. And as the message of the gospel spread, they began to understand that Jesus offered a brand new reality. Jesus offered a brand new identity. How you were born, where you were born, who you were born to, what your gender is, it does not define your worth. It does not define your station. It doesn't define your reason for living. You have an identity that is beyond your imagination. You are a child. You are a son or daughter of God. You are adopted into the family. And when people began to realize that, it birthed a hope and excitement and a joy that people throughout the majority of human history could never even imagine. Just a couple of seconds ago, I read a line that the Apostle Paul wrote where he said that if you are in Christ, if you've trusted in Christ, that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male or female. What is he talking about? I want to make that crystal clear. This does not mean that our race, political status, or gender are changed at conversion. Those things aren't changed automatically simply because we trust in Jesus. It does mean that these things are of no value and they don't handicap us when it comes to our relationship with God through Christ. What I'm talking about is a reality that for many of us, we've grown up in this. We've just grown up in a world where every single person has value, has an inherent value. Every single person has dignity. Every single person has rights. And that's common to us. And because we've grown up with a Judeo-Christian history woven into our nation's culture. But many people throughout the world, they never had that. And it was the message of Jesus that said, you know what? You have inherent value. You have inherent worth. And that was validated by the resurrection. But what I'm talking about is just a sip in the deep well of freedom that is found in Jesus. The reason that so many people were drawn to Jesus, the reason that men and women, they were willing to risk their own well-being to place their trust in Jesus is they understood that what he offered went even deeper than that. The resurrection, it validates our new status and it voids our slavery. Continuing on with the Apostle Paul writing about the implications of what it means to trust in Jesus who rose from the dead, he writes this: "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons and daughters, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir." You are no longer a slave. Now, that's something that's hard for us to wrestle with, isn't it? That's hard for us to accept. I mean, being a slave, none of us have ever been a slave. How do we take a statement like that seriously, that trusting in Jesus has set us free from slavery? Let me ask you a couple of questions. If you can't think of yourself as being enslaved to anything, would you do me a favor and would you pick something that you absolutely love, something that you enjoy, and just stop doing that thing and stop desiring that thing altogether? Stop eating junk food. Stop desiring junk food. But let's press a little bit further. Stop yelling. Stop getting angry. Stop thinking lustfully about other people. Stop being greedy. Let's take it up a notch. And you might have a different standard of what you think is right and wrong, and that might be different than my standard of right and wrong. So just pick your own standard. And never, for the rest of your life, ever do anything that you think is wrong ever again. Take that challenge seriously, and it won't be very long until a civil war breaks out inside of you, just like it would break out inside of me, between your impulses and your resolve. Let me press a little bit further. How many of us would be okay with all of our thoughts, all of our conversations, all of the deep motives of our hearts being put on full display for public moral scrutiny? Now, right now, because of social distancing, we're living in the reality where we can only engage each other digitally. Imagine with me for a second, what would it be like? Would you be willing for this to happen? All your thoughts, all your conversations, everything that you do throughout your day, everything that you think, all the deep motivations of your heart. Imagine if there was a way for those things to be live streamed that everyone could watch it whenever they want. Many of us would be embarrassed by that because we have not broken free, and we don't even know how to break free from the unbreakable routine of moral mess-ups in our own lives. Now, the Bible has a word to describe that reality. And the word that the Bible uses to describe that reality of the unbreakable routine of moral mess-ups in you and in me is the word sin. And men and women, not only were they transfixed, not only were they taken over by the fact that Jesus brought a new reality and gave them a new identity and gave them dignity and worth and rights and freedom, but they were overwhelmed. They found incredible joy and hope in the fact that Jesus brings freedom from the reality, from the inescapable tyranny and enslavement of sin. And when they looked at what Jesus actually provided, and they looked at what it cost him to give it, they realized this: Jesus on the cross, he took what we deserve. He paid the price for our moral mess-ups, for our moral regrets, for all the times that you and I morally fall short. The word for that the Bible uses is sin, and that Jesus took on all the consequences, all the debt, all the penalty, and all the payment for that. It's one of the most astounding statements of the cross. I will take what you deserve. The penalty, the consequence, the debt that you deserve to pay, Jesus says, I will pay it for you. But there's another statement of the cross. There's another statement of the cross that's validated by the resurrection, and it might even be more profound than the first. Not only did Jesus take what we deserve, he took what we deserve so that we can have what he deserves. Yes, the promise of the cross is, I will pay the penalty for sin, But the promise of the resurrection is, I now give you all the rights, all the status, all the privileges of what Jesus himself deserved. Everything that comes with being a child of God, Jesus gives to us simply because of love-soaked, grace-filled love. He took what we deserve so that we can have what he deserves. And when this message, when people realized everything that was offered by Christ and that it was validated by his resurrection from the dead, it spread like wildfire all over the world, and it continues to spread today. Maybe you know this, but in the first 300 years of the Christian movement, it was basically illegal to live the gospel. The Roman government made it illegal to proclaim and live out Christianity. And the more they would beat people, the more they would beat Christians, the more people who wanted to become Christians. The more they would kill Christians, the more people who would give their lives to Jesus. As a matter of fact, it was normal in many towns that the law was you had to make sacrifices to idols. And if you didn't, you were thrown in prison. Well, there were so many men and women who refused to worship anything or anyone other than Jesus that the prisons became so full and so overcrowded, they just had to open the prisons and let everybody free. People were overwhelmed with love and joy and excitement for what they received in Christ. As a matter of fact, there was no mistreatment. There was no hurt. There was no crisis. There was even no disease that could dampen their enthusiasm over what they received in Christ. And I want us to remember that these first Christians, they lived in a world where your status, your social status, your worth, your identity, it was fixed and it was predetermined for you. For the majority of human history, the majority of people who have lived under the yoke of devastating poverty and an inferior social status. And there was nothing that anyone could ever do to break out of a low status and break in to a higher social class or a higher social status. There was nothing anyone could do except for adoption. In the Roman world, it was not uncommon for a man to pass on all of his wealth, his status, his title, and his privileges to someone he adopted. And as strange as it might be to us, in the Roman world, the person who was adopted had a higher and more secure standing than even biological children. And when people read what Paul had to say about in Christ we are adopted into the family of God, they would have thought about all the people who they had heard of, maybe some people they had met, who were taken out of poverty and given a status of privilege, sometimes a status of royalty, simply because someone paid the exorbitant fee of adoption for them. Now, they had an advantage that maybe we don't have. Some of the early Christians, they knew of one of the most amazing, famous stories of adoption that maybe you've never heard of. The most illustrious, most successful, most powerful Caesar in the history of Rome was Caesar Augustus. And his story is probably the most famous adoption story you've never heard of. Now, Caesar Augustus is not a name, it's a title. And it was a title given to this young man, Gaius Octavius. Gaius Octavius was born to basically a middle-class family. He didn't have any amazing wealth. He didn't have amazing status, privileges, or rights. His maternal great-uncle was Julius Caesar, related but far enough separated that he didn't get anything from being related to Julius Caesar. No power, no fame, no money, no nothing. Now, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, Gaius Octavius, he was 18 years old at the time. Gaius Octavius and many of the other distant relatives in the family decided to travel to the funeral. And it was on his way to the funeral that he discovered that he had been adopted by Julius Caesar. And when the will was read, Gaius Octavius immediately took on all the rights, privileges, and status of son of Caesar. When he heard, you have been adopted by Julius Caesar, what would you do? This is what he did. He immediately called himself son of Caesar and to begin to act like he was the emperor of Rome. Now, as you hear this story, you might be wondering, maybe there had to be something spectacular, there had to be something special about this young man that Julius Caesar would want to adopt him and pass on his rights and title and privilege. I don't think so. His contemporaries, the contemporaries of Gaius Octavius, they describe him as short, weak, with bad teeth, covered with spots and birthmarks. Right? He's not the captain of the football team. He's not going to be featured on The Bachelor. Now, as you can imagine, many Roman senators, politicians, officials, and generals, they were upset, and many of them were jealous that this incredible gift, this status and this privilege was just flippantly handed over to a snaggletooth teenager. And probably his greatest rival was a guy named Mark Antony. What you need to know about Mark Antony is he is the exact opposite of Gaius Octavius. He is described as being tall, physically imposing, very good looking, a ladies' man. He was a successful general. He was a battle-tested leader of men, and he was the number one rival of Gaius Octavius to actually become the next Caesar. Well, as this saga played out, it became apparent that all of the Roman officials and senators, they were going to throw their weight of support behind Gaius Octavius and not Mark Antony. He was furious, and just an anger-soaked, jealous rage, he tried to publicly humiliate and shame Gaius Octavius. In front of everyone, he said this, "You, boy, owe everything to your name." You see, when Gaius Octavius was adopted by Julius Caesar, it gave him a brand new top card. It gave him something that fundamentally changed his identity, it changed his place in history, and it changed his place in the world, and it changed his place in the Roman Empire. And when Mark Antony lashed out, what he was actually doing was lashing out against grace. He was saying, "You're no better than me. You don't deserve this. Everything you get, you owe to the irrational kindness of an emperor who gave you his name." You want to know what? Mark Antony is exactly right. Everything that Gaius Octavius got, he got because of the irrational kindness of a king who adopted him into his family. Now imagine that this isn't just an historical backdrop. This isn't some random facts from history. This is recent history. Imagine with these details fresh on your mind, you now read these words for the first time. It's like reading it for the first time. And I want you to let these words of Paul wash over you. Let them excite you. Think about the story that I just told you. And that would have been in the back of the mind of everyone who heard these words for the very first time. Because you are his sons and daughters, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, "Abba, Father." So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Everybody has to answer two questions in life. Who are you and whose are you? The gospel answers both, but I want to focus on how it answers the second question. It says that you are loved, you are accepted, you are forgiven if you have given Jesus Christ your trust, your faith, your allegiance. And not only are you forgiven, you are given everything. You are given the status and the privileges of an heir. Jesus took what we deserve so that we can have what he deserves.